Drew Dyck is the author of this book, Generation X Christian, Why Young Adults Are Leaving the Faith and How to Bring Them Back. It's a very, very interesting book. I read it from cover to cover, found it very fascinating, very informative. And before I get into something that doesn't really relate to the book at all, directly, what is it you do for Christianity Today magazine?
I'm the managing editor of Leadership Journal.
Right.
Which is a publication for pastors and church leaders.
Right, and I remember getting that years ago before, I mean, it's been around for what, 30 years maybe?
Oh yeah, well, at least since the 80s.
Yeah, before you were born probably.
Yeah, almost.
Almost, almost. And in the book you talk about young people who are leaving the faith, and you categorize them as postmodern leavers, recoilers, modern leavers, neo-pagans, rebels, and drifters. Very interesting analysis, but before we get to that, I want to show the front page of the Globe and Mail to this camera here. Okay. Now, here you have a, you say, what's this all about? Well, political upheavals around the world is the title. All right. Let's move down here. It began with Tunisia last week. Remember we talked about it? And how the Arab world were nervous about what this might mean, keeping in mind that more than half of the population of Arab countries around the world are under 30 years of age, right? The interesting thing about Tunisia was that they couldn't have done it without Facebook and Twitter, but Facebook was the main player. A day or two after Ben Ali, the corrupt president, fled the country, there were a group of Tunisians went to Palo Alto, California, where the headquarters of Facebook is, and thanked Facebook for being catalyst to the revolution. Yemen, a young activist is shot dead there, 19 arrested, and suddenly they're facing retaliatory protests from students inspired to action by this uprising in Tunisia. And again, Facebook is a player. Egypt, Tunisia's flames, as the paper says, of rebellion spread to Cairo. And there's going to be a nationwide rally there in the next few days against poverty, corruption, and police brutality. It's planned for tomorrow, actually. Again, this relates to Tunisia. And then Belgium. Now, we're not talking about an Arab nation here, but they've been without a government for 7 months. And the students have taken to the streets. They have a campaign called Shame, a Facebook campaign. Now, it seems to me, Drew, and you don't address it directly in the book, how could you? But there is something afoot in the world, the like of which the world has never seen. Instant information, and it's young person to young person through social networking that literally has the potential to change the world. What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's fascinating to see what's happening globally and the role that young people are able to take in these revolutions and upheavals in countries that they would have not been able to a generation ago because of this new technology. And I think there's a lesson for the church here, and that is, we can sit back and rest on our laurels and hope that young people walk through the door of a church, but the plain fact is that many of them will never darken the door of a church. And we need to go to where they're at, and many of them are turning to social media like Facebook and Twitter, and we need to go to where they are instead of waiting for them to come to us.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to ask you a very tough question.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and it's the thing that occurred to me again and again as I was reading your book. You talk about young adults leaving the faith. How does one leave the faith? See, I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
I almost got the impression reading your book, this like they're leaving the restaurant, or they're leaving the Bears to cheer for the Packers. It's like they had a loyalty here, but now they're going to shift their loyalty somewhere else. It seems to me that when you've got a genuine faith, you're overwhelmed by the love of God. How do you walk away from being loved?
That's a great question, and I realized that when I wrote the book, and especially when I titled it Generation X Christian, EX Christian. I was opening a theological can of worms because, if someone's truly a Christian, how can they walk away? And if they do walk away, isn't that proof that they were never in the family of God to begin with?
Or have they walked away from a culture?
Sure. And I think that's often the case. And I do state this in kind of a sidebar in the book, that I wasn't, by using these terms, I wasn't trying to assert that they were ever Christians in any ultimate sense. And the plain truth is, I don't know. But why I chose that term, ex-Christian, was because I wanted to honor the way in which they describe themselves. And many of the people that I tracked down, mainly 20-somethings, they really did consider themselves to be in the fold. They grew up in the church and then walked away. But it is disturbing, you're right, because often I think that is the way it is for the younger generation. It is just become a culture. It's maybe not something that was core deep. They didn't have a true dynamic connection to Christ. And so they walk away from it and shed it like it's a bad habit.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, it is definitely proof that there was something missing in the first place.
Like, I was overwhelmed, blindsided by the love of God when I was 5 years of age. In a very deeply personal, alone experience with the Lord. Something I wasn't looking for, something that just literally blindsided me. And I was so overwhelmed with the love of God for me that I've never been able to get over it, and never have wanted to get over it. And I certainly could never walk away from it any more than I could walk away from the love my wife and my kids and my grandkids have for me. How would I walk away from that? How could I walk away from that?
Sure. Yeah, and that's the ideal, right? I mean, what's emerged from some recent research, including my own, just sitting down with people and having these in-depth conversations, is that if there are not if they're missing, these young people, if they're missing a couple of key experiences, something like that where they had a real connection to God, and also another thing that they need is some good education. A lot of young people leave the church, they go off to college or into the work world, and they really don't have a solid basis for their beliefs. They don't know why they believe what they believe. So you need to have that heart experience, the emotional component, and the, I don't want to use the word intellectual, but kind of a biblical grounding in the faith. Or if you don't have one of those two, and if you don't have both, your faith is very vulnerable.
Now, you talk about postmodernism in the first part of the book, and this is a term that's been maybe way overused. It's kind of like the word paradigm. Sure. You just say, oh no, there's that word again. There is something there. You talk about how postmodern kids, the emphasis is on the experience, the existential, what's happening to me now. You talk about how truth is a relative thing, and what's true for me is not necessarily what's true for you, and what's true for you, good for you, but there's no sense of objective truth or any even hint of absolute truth. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, well, you know what? The Pentecostals were into this 100 years ago. Yeah. And it doesn't surprise me that Pentecostals, and charismatics, are by and large the phenomenon in Christian growth, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. There's almost 1 billion of them now, and it keeps growing and growing and growing. But the emphasis always with the Pentecostals and the charismatics was on the experience, the present-day experience of the Holy Spirit, and you can know Him now.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if this postmodern reaction of kids raised in the faith was more a reaction to the intellectualizing of faith through the evangelical movement, which was not necessarily a Pentecostal emphasis. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, because if we've been guilty of something in the evangelical church, especially over past decades, it's kind of reducing biblical truth to a set of propositions.
Yeah, to a kind of a modernistic, sure. Linear, analytical approach.
Yeah, and even things like the 4 spiritual laws, a great tool for its time. Yeah. But sometimes when you kind of bottom line biblical truth or Christian faith to a few set of propositions and say, hey, if you just kind of sign off on this, and even if you utter a prayer or sign a pledge, then you're in the club. Well, a lot of young people, I think, rightly reject that as being over simplistic or reductionistic. And so the way I kind of stumbled upon this topic, I actually had a friend from high school come to visit me, and we had both grown up in the church. Our fathers were both pastors, and I remember we had dinner, and he announced to me in a rather matter-of-fact way that he had left his Christian faith. And that got my attention because we'd had such remarkably similar upbringings. And I remember at that point I kind of busted out my best apologetics. I quoted C.S. Lewis, and I remember at the end of our discussion, I talk about this in the book, he said, you know what, that makes sense, but I don't think reason and rationality are the only ways to find truth. And that silenced me, because I thought, how can I reason with someone who doesn't think reason is the primary way to work out your beliefs. And I didn't know it then, but I was encountering what we call postmodernism, at least as a worldview. And you're right, it's a phrase that gets used so much, and it's hard to pin down because it means different things in different fields. But as a worldview, I think it does have some identifiable characteristics, that kind of suspicion of meta-narratives, that is, these kind of big overarching stories, and also a bit of an allergy to rationality and kind of cold logic. And so with folks like that, I think, we don't need to beat ourselves up and try to shove propositional truths down their throat. We have to have that conversation with them at some point, but initially, invite them to serve with you, get them into the presence of God, into the community of believers, and so that they can kind of belong before they believe.
I think this postmodern approach is a Western indulgence. When I'm working with young people and young adults in Africa, I encounter none of this.
Yeah.
Absolutely none of it.
Yeah.
Because they, in the African culture, especially when you're dealing with people who are living on less than $1 a day, they have a very profound sense of their vulnerability. And as believers, their only hope is the Lord. And they have this profound sense of the battle that they're in and the evil that surrounds them. And so their only hope is the Lord. And they have this immediate sense of faith, this immediate sense of Christ with them, the hope of glory. And I don't encounter this. I'm really wondering if this is a Western phenomenon.
Absolutely. I think so. People have responded to my book by saying, well, does this mean if young people are really leaving the faith, and I think they are in the Western world, they'll say, does this mean that Christianity's in trouble? And my response is, Christianity's just fine. Well, for one, Jesus promised that he'd build his church and the gates of hell wouldn't stand against it. And so that's ultimately what I place my hope on. But like you said, around the world, young people are coming to faith in droves, and not just young people.
Yeah.
As you know, in Africa now, I think it's 54% are Christians, whereas 100 years ago it was 10%. South America, people are coming to Christ like crazy. China, David Aikman predicts that in 30 years, 1 in 3 Chinese people could be Christians. So we're seeing a fluorescence of faith around the globe that we haven't seen since the book of Acts. But what's happening, my concern is what's happening in the Western world right now. Of course, in Europe, which is clearly post-Christian, and even in America, where I see a generation that is walking away not only from the church, but often from the faith. And I'm not convinced that they'll naturally come back or automatically come back.
Are American young people going to embrace the religious right if they are young men and women of faith, or are they going to vote Democrat? I mean, how is their worldview impacted by their postmodernism?
Well, I think among the young people in the States anyway, there's been a clear rejection of the ideology of the religious right. In fact, that's one of the things that I believe is driving this trend of people walking away from the faith, is the sort of entanglement conservative politics has had with evangelicalism, and there's a strong negative reaction among young people, actually when it comes to really combining any political agenda with Christian faith. And I think that's unfortunate, and I'm not saying that it's bad to be conservative or on a particular topic, but that's a bad hill to die on when it comes to the faith. You don't want your son, your daughter, your friend, your brother, your sister to reject Christian faith because they don't adopt a particular political view.
Peter Hitchens, in his recent book, The Rage Against God, and he's Christopher Hitchens' brother,
That's right.
the famous atheist.
Yeah, I read that book.
Did you read Peter's book?
Yes, I did.
Well, okay, then you can relate to this. He regrets the association of a president, who shall remain nameless, with his profound evangelical faith and his launching of a war on a false premise, and without any regard for tens of thousands of civilians who die, and whose lives are not only snuffed out, but the whole culture. We're talking about Iraq is decimated, and we're still dealing with the results of it. And he's saying young adults look at this and say, well, this is a Christian.
Yeah.
Who's declaring and effecting an unjust war, and they're saying if that is Christianity, then I don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah, and that has ramifications not only on this continent but around the globe.
I mean, rightly or wrongly, that's that, you know, and Hitchens just makes that observation.
Sure.
And also in the UK, you know, the Prime Minister at the time embracing this thing basically on a false premise. And everybody will say, well, everybody had the same information, everybody had the same false intelligence, and you know, it wasn't one president or one prime minister, it was several who were all duped. But the point is, at the same time, many of these leaders, you know, expressing their profound faith, you know, in the Lord. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to have a profound faith in the Lord and get it so wrong when it comes to the killing of innocent civilians?
Yeah, I guess it is. You know, I think we've seen that not only in our era, but throughout church history. And that's kind of a scary thing. Often people can be well-intentioned and genuinely devoted in their faith, and yet that doesn't mean that they're impervious to making mistakes in politics or whatever job they're in. But I think the important point is when we're talking to young people is to help them differentiate between, you know, authentic, true Christianity and some of the people who they don't like. Often when I talk to young people, their arguments against faith are like, well, if to be a Christian means to be like that guy, that's not what I want. They're not necessarily talking about the incarnation or the divinity of Christ or anything like that, but it's just sort of a kind of rejection of a certain culture that they perceive to be integral to Christian faith.
What I appreciate about your book is you deal with the positive too, and how to deal with some of these kids in a constructive way and model faith for them and encourage them to return to the Lord. You'll have to read the book, friends. It's called The Generation X Christian, in terms of what a recoiler is, somebody who's recoiling to bad experiences as a child in the church, modern leavers who are into Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, neo-pagans who are into superstition and witchcraft, rebels who just, they'd be a rebel, whatever. They just want to have a good time. And then the drifter, the one who's influenced by the crowd. And so if everybody's religious, they're religious. Everybody's irreligious, they're irreligious. It's a really good oversight and very well done, Drew. Thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming our way.
Hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure having you.